Welcome to today's episode of Weird Coffee Science, and today we're going to experiment with human blood. And for that, we will need a live volunteer willing to let me do that. Allow me to introduce you. I apologise for that terrible joke, and let me now go and explain what we're doing today and why we're experimenting with blood. Now, all of this comes from a paper published recently by the University of Bath, all about coffee and breakfast and blood glucose. Now, the paper says that if you have coffee before your breakfast, then your body will have a bigger blood glucose spike from your breakfast. Now, I'm paraphrasing here, but then so did CNN when they reported on this article. Now, I'll get into how they did the test because it's important. What they did is they took a group of people and they split them into 3 separate groups. Group 1 went to bed, next morning, got up, came to the lab, had an oral glucose tolerance test. Now, this is a very standardized way of sort of seeing how your body responds to food, specifically to sugar. To do this, you drink a solution of 75 grams of glucose in water, and then over time they draw your blood and look at your blood glucose levels. What they want to see is a relatively small spike and it returning to normal quite quickly. If it goes very high or stays elevated, then that's a concern and it could be a marker for things like diabetes or other health issues. I'm very much paraphrasing here, but the smaller your blood glucose spikes, the better. The shorter your blood glucose spikes, the better. Now, this is also important. I'm not a doctor. I'm not anything close to a doctor. I hold no qualifications whatsoever in any of this stuff. But then I also don't hold any qualifications in coffee. Maybe let's not think about that too much. Back to the test. So group 1 comes in and has an oral glucose tolerance test. And they're kind of the baseline. They've had no coffee in the morning, they've had a good night's sleep. Group 2 has a bad night's sleep. They are woken and they've got to respond to a text message quite often throughout the night. So they have this broken night's sleep, they come in, they have coffee, and then they do the test. Group 3 comes in after this bad night's sleep, no coffee, and then the glucose tolerance test. Now, their results were pretty interesting. One thing they expected is that a bad night's sleep should sort of make your glucose response worse. That's been shown in a bunch of tests. That didn't actually happen here. But what they did find is the group that had the coffee had a bigger spike in their blood glucose from the oral glucose tolerance test. Now, when I read this study, I did think, interesting, concerning. A lot of people like coffee and then breakfast. Now, I don't really eat breakfast, but I do have one small advantage in this whole thing. I just happen to be wearing, for no real reason other than my own interest, a continuous blood glucose measuring device. It sits on my arm here, embedded under my skin, and it checks my blood glucose every 15 minutes, and I can read the data from it with an app on my phone. I'm not going to get into why I'm doing this. I'm just interested in the topic as a whole, and you can buy them if you want to, but that's by the by. What I realized is that I can replicate this test. Is it true? Is it true for me? And this is important, and we'll touch on that later because everyone is a little different. So that's what I set out to do. I decided I would do a 4-day experiment and run 4 different tests. I would have breakfast without coffee, I'd have coffee then breakfast, and then I'd explore a couple of other things that I thought might be interesting. Now, I didn't want to do an oral glucose tolerance test, not because I have any issue with it, but because it just doesn't seem like the real world. 75 grams of glucose will give you about 300 calories of energy, so I picked a breakfast that had about 300 calories that was a bit more real world, but still pretty carbohydrate heavy, so in this case, I chose porridge. Something that a lot of people see as being pretty healthy, pretty common breakfast, and so I had 300 calories of porridge. Now, the other thing that was notably different is the amount of caffeine that I was ingesting. In the case of the study, they were ingesting 300 milligrams of caffeine dosed using Nescafe instant coffee. That's not how my mornings start. So I made a delicious cup of coffee from 20 grams of ground coffee to about 330 grams of water, but that's the sort of dose there. And that would have probably had maybe even half the caffeine content, but it felt to me a much more real-world environment to do a real cup of coffee and a real breakfast rather than a massive whack of instant coffee and a ton of glucose afterwards. What we'll do now is look at my results. And we'll start with day 1. The results from day 1 were pretty surprising to me. You can see my blood has a pretty big spike in blood glucose. It fades pretty quickly, and I suppose that's good news. Now, to be honest, I didn't think porridge would have this effect. I knew, obviously, it's high in carbohydrate, but I just didn't see it as being a sweet, sugary breakfast, but it had a pretty big hit on my blood glucose. That surprised me. I was comforted to see it go away again, but really, that's a pretty high number from something like a bowl of porridge. But let's compare that to day 2, where I have some coffee first. Now this is interesting to me. I've had the coffee and then the breakfast, and it is to the gram an identical breakfast. It is the same grammage of porridge oats in there every single time. It's cooked the same way every single time. But you'll see my blood glucose spike is a little bit lower. Now, that's the opposite of what you would expect to happen, but I will say, and we'll come back to this a lot, everyone is different, and everyone has a different kind of response to foods, and that's one of the reasons that I have one of these things in my arm to start with. Now, one more point worth noting is that I think in the study, people had abstained from coffee for a couple of days before doing the test. I am a habitual coffee drinker. I drink it probably at least twice a day, every single day. And there may be some adaptation here that my body has gone through that may not be as present for people who took part in the study. Overall, though, right now, I have to say, I'm not hugely concerned for me about the order in which I have my coffee or my breakfast. I don't see there being a particularly big impact, though I would argue maybe I don't want any kind of spike whatsoever. And that's where we come into day 3. Now for day 3, about half an hour after eating breakfast, I went for a walk. This for me is a kind of interesting result. You can see the blood glucose begin to climb, but ultimately pretty quickly tails off. And that's because during a good, strong, solid walk, I begin to use the glucose entering my blood. And so I have a smaller spike. I'll release less insulin. All of that stuff is kind of good news. So that, I think, is really super interesting as an outcome of this whole thing. Before we get into day 4, which I think is the most interesting of the days, I do have a couple of quick things to talk about. Firstly, there is a giveaway with this video. For every sponsored video right now, I'm giving away 5 Baratza Encore grinders. The world is a little bit tough right now, and if you can't afford a grinder and you want to start grinding with a great grinder, well, enter in the competition down below. If you can afford a grinder, please go and support a local business. But if you can't, click down below. Quick note, you must be in one of the 37 countries around the world that Baratza are able to ship and warranty the grinder in. If you're not in one of those countries, I'm really sorry. I'll try and find something for you in the future. But for now, for this giveaway, you've got to be in one of those 37 countries. And all of this is possible because this video has a sponsor. It's sponsored by Squarespace. If you need a website or a domain, if you want to create a beautiful presence for yourself online, then I would strongly recommend checking out Squarespace. Squarespace makes it so easy to start with one of their stunning templates and fill it with your personality, your ideas, your words, your images. And then you can create something very, very quickly, very easily that is a great representation of who you are online. Building it on Squarespace as a platform means it's going to look great on every single browser, every single device. There's nothing to patch, upgrade, or install or worry about over time. It's going to look great ongoing. If you're curious, check out the link down below in the description. Sign up for a free trial. Build something. And at the end of 14 days, when you're ready to launch, use code James Hoffmann for 10% off any website or domain. Thanks to Squarespace for sponsoring this video. Day 4, what I think is the most interesting day. And this is going to get really close to me giving you advice about diet, which I'm not trying to do. Do not take dietary advice from me. I'm just going to talk about what worked for me from my reading. Now, I've been interested in blood glucose for a little while and interested in what you can do to sort of reduce the spikes in your blood glucose. And one of the things that I'd read fairly early on is the order in which you eat your food can have an impact on your blood glucose. If you eat kind of proteins first, you'll reduce the spike. So I thought I'd do a simple test. Before I cooked the porridge, I just cooked up a couple of eggs and a little bit of butter. Scrambled them up in the pan, ate them, and then cooked the porridge. That little bit of protein at the start had a fascinating impact on my blood glucose. There's barely a spike. And to me, that was super, super, super interesting. Now, not everyone is interested in blood glucose. Not everyone is interested in reducing the spikes in their blood glucose. There's a ton of evidence about why smaller spikes might be a good thing, why reducing, your peaks and troughs of blood glucose in your life might be a good thing. I'm not going to tell you about those. I'm going to leave you some links down below. Check them out if you are interested. But what I would say is that from my individual little experiment, I didn't see the same effects. I think the authors speculated on a couple of reasons why caffeine did this. What was the mechanism behind it? And I think one of them was that it was an adenosine inhibitor. Basically, it blocks receptor sites for this hormone called adenosine that acts to calm you down, lower your heart rate. Caffeine doesn't necessarily perk you up, it just stops you calming down in quite the same way. So they thought that was one idea. Another one was sort of a synergy with a hormone called cortisol. Now, your cortisol generally increases just before waking as part of your waking up process. Cortisol on its own can cause a bigger spike in blood glucose. You tend to see a rise in your blood glucose before waking, and cortisol is thought to drive that. And so therefore they thought caffeine might be a sort of accelerating that particular mechanism. Again, I didn't necessarily see that. I saw a small increase in my blood glucose before waking, but I didn't see that sort of ramping up effect personally. And this is really the takeaway from all this. I'm not saying you have to go and get a continuous glucose monitor, put it on your arm and obsess about this stuff for a couple of weeks. That's not necessary, and that's very expensive, frankly. So I'm not recommending that. But I would say if you are concerned about this stuff, then there are tools out there to investigate this a little bit more and pay attention to this stuff. If you have a history of diabetes or type 2 diabetes in your family, that may be a bigger concern. But again, I'm not trying to give you health advice here. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a registered professional of any kind. I'm just a dude making coffee videos on YouTube. So, think about that, about where you get your advice. Do your reading for sure. When you read studies like this, it's just worth understanding how relevant it may or may not be to you. But for me, in this case, my little n=1 experiment, yeah, it didn't hold up. I'm having coffee before breakfast on the days that I have breakfast, which honestly is not most days, but that's a whole other topic that we're just not going to get into. But I'm curious, did you read this study? Did you see this? Did you dismiss it out of hand? Did you think it was kind of irrelevant to you? Or did it make you stop and think for a minute? I'd love to hear from you down in the comments below. But for now, I'll say thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great day.